to the quiz? No? Okay, so far so good. All right.
I'm sorry. I have a question.
Yes, please.
How much time do we have when we open the quiz?
Well, how much time would you consider fair? That's like I don't have I need to put some kind of a limit, but would like 2 hours do it?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure, but I only wanted to check if you know already.
Well, okay. So what you're supposed to do is you do not open the test and then look into your topics. You first read the topics, you mark the keywords and the most important parts. So you could go back to your notes once you've opened the quiz. And then you'd have like 10 or 12 questions to answer, and you will have your notes in front of you. So would that work?
Yes, I understand. I just wanted to check
So I
if
will give you
everything is
2 hours to do it. I think that I can do it in 2 hours, even if you haven't opened the reading before, uh, because it's not such a long reading. Also, if it happens that your internet connection breaks or you're kicked out of the program or something like that, let me know. I can take you back, and but you can't do that on your own. So once you logged into the test, you have to finish it. If you're kicked out because I don't know, power goes out, just let me know as soon as you can, and I will open it for you again. No big deal. I mean, don't get into a state of panic or anything. If something doesn't work, we can fix it. Also, I can tell how much time you've spent, or I can see that how much time you've spent doing the test, and I can see you doing it online. So I will be lurking in the shadows, and you won't know that I'm there. So no, that's a joke. I won't be there, but I could do that if I wanted to. And but the point of this is actually for you to read something that won't be a digest that you prepare for exams, and this is also part of how we study or how we're supposed to study. So if you're having any issues with making notes or actually focusing on the keywords while reading, please let me know. Just ask for help if it doesn't make any sense, but it should not be that hard. uh, and
Profesorka,
yes.
izvinite ako sam vas prekinula. Imam pitanje neka nisu u vezi sa kvizom, nego generalno sa predmetom, pa da li da to ostavim za kraj?
Može sad.
Htela sam vas pitam što se tiče silnih knjiga koje ste nam ubacili tamo, ne znam, za midterm, exam preparation i to, pa sad ima ono book on poetry, book on drama, pa u exam preparation ima ono telling stories annotated i to. I sad, da li mi najviše gledamo kad učimo ovo week 1, week 2, exam texts i tako to, a te knjige od po 300 kusur strana, jel nam to više kao dopunsko nešto što se tiče tih knjiga ili bi trebalo sve da koristimo od literature što ste nam poslali?
Ovako, dakle, to su knjige, predavanja i vežbe. To znači da ako recimo niste u prilici da prisustvujete ovim sastancima, što naravno možete ne biti u prilici, apsolutno, možete da se poslužite knjigom. Takođe, ako se nešto od ovoga što ste možda propustili ili ne znam, nije vam selo ili niste zapisali ili se ne sećate, zafali vam neki deo informacije ili vam nešto iz prezentacije ne bude baš jasno, knjige su mesto gde to možete da pogledate. Knjige naravno ne služe da vi sad sednete i učite 1000 strana za ispit, ni slučajno, ne daj Bože. Dakle, ono što treba, na šta treba da se usmerite jeste ovo što su prezentacije, ovo što vam stavim kao eksplicitno, ovo sad pročitajte. I ove teme koje imate za kvizove će takođe dobro doći i za sve ostalo. Dakle, to je nešto što bi trebalo da prođete. Ne može se reći da je nešto obavezno, ništa nije obavezno. Ali ispit se može položiti sa minimumom truda tako što ste prelistali prezentacije neposredno nedelju dana pred test ili slično, ali ako ne želite samo eto tako da ga se rešite, onda imate i ovu dopunsku literaturu. Dakle, ono što hoću da kažem je da knjige, da je normalno vreme, biste mogli da nađete ove koje sam tu stavila u biblioteci. I to su knjige koje se tačno tiču ovoga što mi ovde radimo. Dakle, to su knjige iz kojih ja uzimam materijal za predavanje. Uz, naravno, većinu tog materijala, nije sve iz knjiga, ali veći deo jeste. Ako vam zatreba dodatnih objašnjenja, to je tu. A takođe knjige su veoma korisne u budućnosti, te mogu da posluže, pa zato je to korisno imati, ali ne znači da treba da se e, usmerite da pređete, ne znam, 50 strana po danu i tako dalje, da učite iz knjige, to nije obavezno. Mislim, držimo se ovoga što je week 1, week 2, week 3 i tako dalje. Ako nešto bude potrebno baš iz knjige ili neko recimo nešto propusti pa može da pita, a ja koji deo u knjizi sad da pogledam da bih to razjasnio sebi. Naročito recimo će to biti knjiga, jedna će ova o poeziji će biti korisna sledeće nedelje kad se budemo bavili ovim nekim aspektima jezika, dakle figurative speech, metaphors i tako dalje i kako se kroz istoriju pristupalo ideji prenesenog značenja u jeziku, ali dakle odgovor je pomoćno je sredstvo. Koliko ćete se pomagati takođe zavisi od toga koja vam je polazna pozicija, koliko se osjećate sigurno u ovom svemu ili se ne osjećate sigurno, a želeli biste da proverite i tako dalje, ali ne morate učiti iz knjige, ukratko rečeno. Ok.
Razumem, hvala.
Okay, so today's topic is about poetry. Is there anyone who is really fond of reading or writing poetry? Nobody? Really? Okay, so let me rephrase the question. What are the circumstances in which you actually do read poetry other than I have to because it's on my reading list for school or for the exam? Do you have a favorite poet? Nobody has a favorite poet. Come on, guys. Not even in Serbian?
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Oh, well, I'm not really
This
fond of poetry, but I always
Vladislav Petković this.
but
Okay.
I enjoy reading Edgar Allan Poe. I love his poems.
Okay, so we've got this and we've got Edgar Allan Poe. Did you encounter that in school?
Yes, in high school.
In private school, okay. Did you read poetry when you were younger? When do people read poetry would be the general question.
I think we start when we're young in school because we have to learn them by heart, and that's maybe the first time, actually maybe even before school, when we're really young, when parents try to teach us anything at all, so we learn poems. And then later at school we have to learn some of them by heart, and some of us continue reading after that if we get interested, and some don't
Okay,
get interested.
but we are interested in poetry because it provides us with an emotional experience. School purpose that you described could be slightly different. And learning poems by heart has to do with how we perceive language, perhaps. So that could be one of the reasons why people get involved. But basically, emotional experience is something that probably would be a good reason why would people read poetry. Okay, but how do we study poetry is slightly different from how we actually get into reading it. So, how do we know that a poem is a poem? Oh. What is the foundational concept of a poem or poetry in general? Yes?
Certain words are organized in a certain way.
Okay, you're on the right track. Elaborate.
Well, we have this. We have a bunch of words that are organized, and they have the same topic. They tell a certain story, but they're organized differently from prose. Prose is just like a text, and poetry can rhyme, but not necessarily.
Okay, so poetry can is obviously different, even when you look at it, is different from prose.
It has also some kind of rhythm to it.
And when you hear it, it would have a rhythm to it. That's right. And that rhythm would actually present a difference between common everyday speech and an intended message that would be somehow condensed or more dense than a conversation, for example. Okay, so we're going to go through several aspects of what poetry is and what poetry does, so to say, and how it is constructed. Because most of the poetry up till 1920s, I think, or maybe somewhat sooner, so the beginning of the 20th century was not a free form. So the free verse or the free form actually is something that dominates poetry for last 120 years or so. And before that, it was a very elaborate structure that you couldn't make a mistake and say that something is not a poem if it actually exhibited features that would qualify it. So what those features were and how this construction business actually took place is going to be our topic for today. And also we will focus not well, for the first part, focus on the sound play because that's what the rhythm and the rhyme constitute the play with the sound. That is one of the dominant features of poetry. Okay, so to remember what we talked about, which I understand was a rather abstract talk last week. What literature is and how poetry fits in that. Literature, as we said, is a group of texts with features that they have in common, that they are written or recorded, therefore finalized and adapted to the medium, that they are fictional in the sense that they do not relate to the reality around us directly, so not about real people and events that actually took place, or they're even if they are about that, they do not represent a recording of those people or events, but rather an interpretation. In that, literature is creative and it comes from a source which is recognized as an author. And we assume in that, since it becomes or it originates from a mind of a particular genius, that it would be original. But we already said that original in that sense that it never occurred before. It's not exactly something that we could easily relate to literature or the art of words. And intertextuality and collective cultural experience actually play a role in all that. So, to link it to poetry, to be a poet required, probably still does, but for a long time required extensive education and great knowledge of the language, of the form, and of the effect, and what happened before. So, who preceded or what kind of approach to poetry preceded one's work in order to be able to create differently or to incorporate the previous knowledge into something new that they were creating at the time. Therefore, the meaning of a literary work, as well as poems, is a network of influences. And we could discuss in that network of influences aesthetic effects, so how pleasing or how disturbing to the senses work of literature is. Poetics, which is actually dealing with the rules of construction, so foundations or basic basic laws that govern creation of a literary work. But we can also talk about ideas and ideological presuppositions in the sense of ethical and political questions that are related to a particular work of literature. All right, so we will focus for now on poetics and genre in the sense that poetry is one of the three mega genres. To remind you again, poetics means either going with the expected or conventional rules of composition or challenging those and going against the expectations or even shocking people with the exploitation of the convention to one's advantage. And I'll show you how that operated in the case of Vladimir Nabokov's Pale Fire. Poetics as a study of basic concepts. So, what kind of things participate in the making of individual forms, and how those individual forms align, have similarities in order to form genres. So, genre must establish basic similarity of form and function between the items that belong to the same genre, so same kind, in form and function. So, what it is, what it looks like, and what it does. Also, in the questions of genre, we are supposed to figure out how different individual items that are generally grouped together are between themselves. So they are not just a knockoff or a series of copies, but they share some features while they're very different in something else. Genre or subgenre is not something that insists on purity, so it could be mixed, impure, or hybrid. It could combine deliberately several things, and also it changes in time, so it is in flux. So love stories from chivalric romances to contemporary love stories, so chick literature, for example, or science fiction from Jules Verne to Star Trek. They would exhibit significant changes through time. I expect you've met Shakespeare's sonnets so far, so I will not go into that, but you do know that sonnet is a very strict form, yes? Okay, so sonnet is without a doubt a poem, and it has certain features or certain structural features that had to be fulfilled in order for a poem to be a sonnet. But basically, what we know is when we look at it, it is a poem because it is in verse, it has lines, it's mid-page, and it sort of is short or relatively short. Here I will show you something that is what it looks like, the best I could find, is a piece of writing called Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. Vladimir Nabokov is a novelist, as you might already know. Has anyone read this one? No? How about Lolita? Do you know about Lolita?
Yes, I read it.
You read Lolita. So it's the same writer. And this particular book is considered to be a novel, but here is what it looks like. Here is the content: foreword, Pale Fire, a poem in 4 cantos, commentary and index. And it starts with a foreword, which goes on for almost 9 pages, and the foreword is signed by a certain Charles Kinbote. And then it looks like for next 30 pages, looks like a poem. And after that, we actually enter this dubious phase where there is a commentary which starts at page 56 and it goes on for 100 pages. These are like footnotes to the lines of the poem. And in the foreword and in the commentary is where the novel is. So this is actually formally looking like something else, but doing a completely different thing. And it's considered to be experimental writing, of course, but it's not just that. It actually exploits our conventional understanding of the basics of the foundational concepts or the basics of basic elements that genres are made of. So which are those basic units which have to be there in order to establish this required aesthetic effect that would be that would qualify something as either poetry, drama, or prose? Here we have the blue part. Just to check something. Yeah, it's okay. The blue part is the necessary component. You can't have a poem without verse. Verse can be very different, and we'll see what verse actually is, but that's a requirement. You could have rhyme, but you don't have to. You could have sound effects such as assonance, but you don't have to. You could have regular foot and meter, and we'll play with that today as well. But you also don't have to have that. But the only thing you do have to have is this kind of verse that actually exists in the form of condensed meaning in lines. To have drama as a genre, or to have a work of literature qualified as drama, it only needs to have action. You will see in 2 weeks' time that drama doesn't have to have speech, doesn't have to be in verse, doesn't have to have characters, setting, or dialogue. It only has to have action. And these are also experimental forms which deal with reducing drama to action only. While prose needs to be about events, needs to tell a story, and how it does so, or with what elements included in telling the story, still remains an option. So remains within the sphere of individual differences. Foundational concepts also involve speaker, so who is the one speaking to the reader. And in poetry, it's going to be lyrical I. In prose, it's going to be different kinds of narrators. And in drama, it would probably be characters themselves, if there are any, or the action itself, if there aren't any. And another question is who sees, or whose mind is the filter for the data, for the information the reader is presented with. So is it narrator's mind, or is it one of the characters' mind, or is it something completely else? So we'll get there when we get to the prose, but still these foundational concepts are something that are shared with some of those are of course shared, and some are specific to a particular genre. Okay, so for poetry, we can determine our foundational concepts or their um, activity in several layers or levels. Those would be typographical, what it looks like visual, what it looks like on the page, sound effects, imagery, and idea. We will focus on typographical and sound today, and imagery and idea would be for the next week. Poetry shares features with literature in using specialized language that is very dense and has no pragmatic function, so it's not very useful in the real world, like the Hitchhiker's Guide Through Galaxy is not really useful as a guide. And it also establishes ambiguity as a principle. That means that there are no correct answers in an interpretation of a literary text. You are entitled to your own interpretation as long as you can ground it in sound arguments. And there isn't just one possible solution. Formal features of poetry offer us the visual impact that lines on a page, not all page, mid-page lines. Specialized language is somehow different, not just in sound effects, so not just in rhythm and rhyme, but also in the way it is used. Russian formalists called it estrangement of the language or defamiliarization. That is something in Serbian, otuđenje. You've probably heard of it. So to use common language in an uncommon way was the purpose of literature generally, and poetry in particular. And poems are actually required to say a lot in very little space, so you can't use many words. As you know, by sonnets, the space is quite limited. So the use of formal elements is something that they also insist on, and that results in overstructuring. So you have a structure that needs to correspond to particular features, which are phonological, morphological, syntactic, and the use of words does not only depend on their meaning or lexical meaning or denotations, or even connotations, but it also involves how long or how many syllables they have and what the sound effect of that word might be and how it combines with other words and so on and so forth. So this is a very conscious construction, and it reflected for a long time the level of education as much as anything else, not just inspiration, but level of education of the author. Speaker in the poem speaks to the reader directly. The key elements in poetry related to sound patterning probably are most conspicuous, and those are metrics or measurements. Those are actual number of stresses, or metrics describes the rhythm of the poem, or the number of stressed syllables in a line of verse. So line is something obvious. Line is something that you can pronounce with one breath. Sometimes it is actually one thought completed. Sometimes it is not, and then you have the enjambment. But the line of verse is what you say with one breath. You inhale and you just pronounce it. What happens in that line is that those sounds need to be organized. And how we will organize the sounds in order to produce this overstructuring, in order to produce the aesthetic effect, depends on which language we're using and what kind of rhythm of stresses that language requires. So how that happens, versification by definition is formal organization of sounds. That would be a question in your midterm probably. So make a note. It's formal organization of sounds, not how you write verse, because then it's a circular definition. Verse is something that you produce through versification. So verse is something, a line where the sound effects are formally organized. On a micro level, versification actually uses the features of a syllable, whether the syllable is going to be stressed or unstressed, or whether it contains alliteration or some other kind of effect that you can put in one syllable. Those syllables actually combine into longer units to form a line, and there we can already see a pattern. Pattern is usually repetition of something, repetition of elements. So the line also has a dominant foot, combination of stressed and unstressed syllables, and has the number of those combinations repeated, which are called a meter. It could also involve rhyme. That could happen at the end of the line, but also in the middle of the line. On the structural level, so a larger structure, combines lines into stanzas or into poems, and the structure of rhyme determines, for example, villanelle, or determines the sonnet, whether it's going to be Petrarchan or Shakespearean or Spenserian. Haiku is a Japanese form, short form, which limits the number of syllables allowed to be used to 575. And it was an inspiration for a whole movement of imagists that would be modern American poetry of the 1920s, for example, and other things as well, but this in particular. All right, so so far we've seen that the poetry actually is something that produces aesthetic effect by formalizing the use of language. If you remember the poetic function of language with Roman Jakobson, what is the axis of combination and how the choices are made on the axis of selection. Axis of combination would be our line. So what we combine in the line and how we choose the words depends on what kind of effect we want to achieve. And in this case, sound effects that the choices offer are the most important. Subjectivity and personal experience, as I said at the beginning, that's why people read poetry, to actually have this emotional response to personal experience, probably relating to their own personal experience, but initiated by the experiences expressed in the poem. We are not allowed to assume that the speaker is the author, because authors often create entities or consciousness that would represent either a character in their own right, or someone who would be the mediator between what they're willing to share and the reader. So the speaker is not the author. The speaker is the lyrical eye. Poems are relatively short. Have you read any John Donne so far? Metaphysical poets? Yes, no? John Donne?
Yes.
The titoli. Yes, good. How did you find it? Was it too dense for you?
It was interesting.
Okay, but were you able to decipher what any of that means without help?
Well, I think we could sort of mogu sebi reći pretpostaviti. Okay, we could
Get okay.
not everything, but we could get a sense of what it could be.
All right, so you could get the sense what this would be about. All right. I have bad news for you related to John Donne, I'm afraid, because we're going to do next week, we're going to do valediction forbidding mourning in detail. It's in your workbook, and it's just a short announcement. I will place a general announcement for next week soon enough, but it will probably require a lot of effort, and there are video materials to help you out, but he would be a key figure to actually explore this dense expression and to try to understand what he did with metaphors and the figurative use of language. Poetry, of course, focuses on subjectivity or on the subjective experience more than any other thing. And it can have musical qualities, doesn't have to, but could. Overstructuring we already covered, so it insists on features that are phonologically chosen for a purpose and morphologically chosen for a purpose, and that in that poetry deviates from everyday language. To illustrate the counterexample how poetry is different, you would probably notice a bad dialogue in let's say a TV show where it sounds like someone's reciting common mistake. It's very difficult to actually reproduce the way people speak without slipping into recitations. So that's the deviation from everyday language, and poetry can be structured more easily than everyday language. If you're reconstructing or if you're writing a dialogue, it could be even more difficult than writing a poem. One of the most important features of poetry is its self-referentiality, and that means that they ask you to pay attention not just as them poems being an art form, but being the form that is some kind of grandeur, the perfection of form, as well as being an explicit reference to the process of writing of poetry. That might not be the case that we generally focus when we read poetry, but that is one of the aspects of this skill that the poet exhibits, the self-referentiality. Okay, let's try to open this. All right. So at the typographical level, we already discussed lines and mid-page. This is actually from your workbook, and it's taken from a book on translation. This is a poem originally written in German. So the author of the book says it's the night song of the fish. That's the title. Can you tell me why or if this could be qualified as a poem?
Well, it has lines, I guess, and it's in the middle of a page.
Okay.
I honestly don't see how it really is a poem. Okay.
Okay. Do we have elements that we can recognize?
Well, there's a certain image, and have the typographical level, I guess, but how can it be a poem without words?
Okay, but we do have dash in every odd line, so first, third, fifth, and so on, and we have this bracket, horizontal brackets, in every even line, so second, fourth, and so on. So we have an exchange, or so to say, an interplay of elements. What else do we know? Those elements are being repeated in a kind of a structure. So we've got 1, and then we've got 2, and then we've got 3 of the first kind and the 4 of the second kind. So we've got some kind of rhythm 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1. And those elements are different from one another, but in the line they are being repeated. Remember, I said feet are being repeated within the same line. So the foot is actually the combination of syllables, and these could be interpreted as feet. So we've got single, so 1 foot monometer. In the second line, we've got 2 repeated. It could be a dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, and so on. It could be interpreted like that. And yes, it creates an image, and those brackets actually distantly remind us of fish scales, perhaps, and that's how it could be fishes or fish speaking or singing in the night. The idea here is to focus on the repetitions which create the rhythm, and they don't. This is an extreme example, of course, but it also tells you that this is verse and that the poem doesn't need to have rhyme, but we could also interpret finishing or every second line as rhyming with every second line rhyming, yes, because it ends in the same element. So if we wanted to, we could draw an argument that this actually is a poem. In your workbook, you might notice that the translation, I think, into Finnish flips the brackets, and it creates a slightly different image of the fish in the end, but still it's the structure that is being kept together and that is being preserved. All right, so on the typographical level, lines in mid-page, we have meter, that is repetition of units. We have stanzas that create clusters. And also we have the use of punctuation, capitalization, the use of indented lines, splices, so splitting the thought into run-ons, combining two things together. And these are all decisions that the poet made consciously, which also would impact how we read it and therefore impact what we understand from it. To illustrate this, this is A. Cummings and Buffalo Bills. And here we see the structure that is created by putting words together, so splices, and by indentations, and by not using punctuation as we would expect it, and in that creating an effect. At the sound level, this formal arrangement of sounds can involve repetitions, alliterations, assonance, consonants, pauses, and rhyme. And we already discussed that micro level would focus on stress and intonation, line level on foot and meter, and the structural level or macro level on form in entirety. But here I have an example for you. Do you know this Humpty Dumpty? Do you know what Humpty Dumpty is? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty
Yes,
Is
the
it
Dumpty
a
had.
children's poem.
Okay, so it's a nursery rhyme. So it is a kind of a poem that is read to kids for the rhythmic value. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All of King's horses and all of King's men couldn't put Humpty together again. So it doesn't make much sense, if you wish. Humpty Dumpty is an egg. As when there are pictures of it, he would be an egg. What I want to show you is another experiment which does a sort of a sound translation of a poem. Humpty Dumpty is a nursery rhyme which appears in a collection of nursery rhyme called Mother Goose Rhymes. And what here we have an experiment which uses French language and words in French language, creating the sound effect. So these words that are being used here are actual French, but they're being used for the sound effect as if someone with a heavy French accent read Humpty Dumpty in English. So how that operates, have a look.
Moder Gusram by
So this is Mother Goose Rhyme, Moder Goose Rhyme.
Louis Dantin van Houten appears to be a collection of poems in French. In fact, they are English nursery rhymes as spoken in an outrageous French accent. Here's one. Un petit d'un petit, c'est un oval. Un petit d'un petit a de grêtes folles. Un long qui ne se cesse, un long qui ne se mène, qu'importe un petit d'un petit, together again.
So at the level of sound, they produced a Humpty Dumpty in French, but not at the level of meaning. So it doesn't translate, but it still is a sort of a nursery rhyme. It could qualify as a translation because it preserves the sound effect. On the imagery level, poetry creates snapshots of life, and those are usually the descriptions that evoke sensory effect, and it uses a lot of nouns and verbs and a lot of figures of speech. And as an illustration, we have The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams, which is here. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. And you notice that there are a lot of nouns and verbs. Well, adjectives actually, more than verbs. And it creates an image. You can almost see the red wheelbarrow. In the previous slide, if you're interested, you can have a look, or it's a video with a detailed explanation of the poem. At the level of ideas, it is actually combination or patterning of those images and also sounds, which reveal the general. That's what we actually perceive as what the poem is about. The general impact or the general sensory memory, if you wish, that we would relate to, that would be related to an abstract feeling or thought or idea. So love, faith, death, childhood, or some such thing that could not be easily explained other than through imagery and sound. And as an illustration, you have Emily Dickinson and Because I Could Not Stop for Death, if you're interested. And finally, we reach the point where we should be talking about measuring in poetry, or how the sound effect comes into play, or how it is constructed. I need to ask, have you done this? Have you done scansion, how to recognize foot and meter of a poem?
In English,
In
not
English?
really.
Not really. Okay. So we're going to play with it. It's your task in the midterm would be to recognize something, but it won't be really complicated. I will do my best to actually limit whatever the task is to what we did in class, but it won't be the same poem because then it would make no sense at all. So this is actually a lot of fun. But before we go there, we need to figure out why is that there at all. So general principle for measuring in poetry depends on what kind of language we're talking about. Old English as a Germanic language actually depends on stresses for creating the sound structure. So whether stressed syllables are there and how many of them in a line, while the Romance languages and classical languages depend on the number of syllables only. So regular, or they repeat the same number of syllables. Epski deseterac je primjer ovog drugog. Nije bitno kakvi su, ali morate da ih imate 10. As you already know, that English language suffered a lot of change, and probably with the historical circumstances, a lot of influences that altered the structure and the lexis of the language. And it starts with being an essential alliterative verse of the Anglo-Saxon poetry, which requires 4 stresses per line. And the total number of syllables between can be varied, could be different. 2 or 3 stressed syllables have to become with the same consonant cluster or the same sound, and that is how they alliterate. And the line or the verse is called the stick, like the stick that you make from wood. So one stick was made out of 2 hemi-sticks or half sticks, and they're divided by a pause in the middle, or the caesura. So that were the rules of Anglo-Saxon poetry, and I don't think you've actually listened to it so far, so we're going to listen to a few lines of Beowulf in Anglo-Saxon. Pay attention to the repetitions, so you probably won't understand much, but just try to listen to what is being repeated.
What we gar denna in jarda hum, Theid kunninga thrym je frunon, Hoe tha edelingast ellen fremedon. Oft shield shaving sheldna thratum, Monigum maithum meldosetla of terch, Ezo de erlas, Sith an arist werth felshaft wunden. Eithas frovri je bad, Wegs under woknum werth myndum thach, Of that him whilch thara sitindra over hron ra de huran shode gompan yuldan, that was good gunning.
Okay, so you could probably notice that the number of syllables is not the same, it varies, but the repetitions or the bouncing syllables are always the same. It is the case with contemporary or more modern English in nursery rhymes, in rap music as well. What happened next with the English language is the influx from the French and from Romance languages and the adoption of metrical models from Italian and French literature. And that required regular number of syllables in the line, so they were either 8 or 10, with an end rhyme, which was either couplets or rhyme royal. And these are the features that actually describe Canterbury Tales. Sorry about the spelling, I will fix it here. And that was also a standard narrative meter in Middle Ages. So that's how they told stories. As in Anglo-Saxon poetry, it wasn't for the sensory effect; it was for telling stories. That was the purpose of the the poem. Here we have an example of a recitation in Middle English of the prologue of the Canterbury Tales. Just to illustrate how language is different, and yet it is still not the English that you can recognize.
One at April, with his shortest sota, the drought of March hath burst to the rota, and bathed every vine in switch liquor, of which thereto engendered is the flower. When Zephyrus eke with his sweeter breath, inspired hath in every old and eth the tender croppes, and the youngest sonna hath in his ram is halve corsarona. And smalla foles mocken melodia, that slepen all the night with open ear.
And so on. So you notice that the language is very different and the verse is quite has nothing in common with the reading of Beowulf. It in contemporary or more contemporary English, it exists. That kind of verse exists in, for example, William Blake's Songs of Innocence, Holy Thursday. And finally, the common, the verse that we perceive as normal English, modern, or from 15th century onward, after the vowel shift kind of a meter would be accentual syllabic. That means that we have also fixed number of syllables, but fixed number of stresses too. So this is a combination of the previous two. And in the syntax and the sound, we find the language play. And that is the source of this aesthetic effect. Of course, it doesn't mean that it needs to be exactly regular. There are possibilities of variations or inserting slight variations in order to avoid the monotonous effect of those numerous repetitions. Contemporary poetry from 20th century onwards is usually written in free verse, and that is described as having irregular patterns of stress and syllables, so no regular pattern basically. It's not a pattern in itself, but just a lack of, which is different from blank verse. Blank verse is iambic pentameter, which does not rhyme, sorry, another mistake. So which does not rhyme, and it's something that Shakespeare's plays were written in. Free verse is first used by Walt Whitman in his collection Leaves of Grass. So there isn't any particular pattern of stress or a number of syllables per line. For example, here we have Ezra Pound. So how do we determine this patterning or scansion? First of all, we need to know what names of the combinations of stressed and unstressed syllables are in English. So in English, dominant would be iambic foot. Trochaic would be less common. And these two first combines unstressed and stressed or stressed and unstressed. So, for example, when you open the dictionary and you look at the markings of stress, that would be an apostrophe before the syllable. So, behold would have an accent or this apostrophe on the hold, while tiger would be marked. The first syllable would be marked. Possibilities for introducing variation would be spondee and pyrrhic. The first one combining two stressed syllables like cupcake. Then the second one combining two unstressed like of the. And that combination of the is very present in poetry writing for the establishing or for breaking up this monotonous rhythm of the dominant foot. A combination of three syllables are dactylic and anapestic. So that means that one is stressed and two would be unstressed. And the stressed part would be placed either in front or at the back. So make a note. When you look at the foot, always just one syllable would be stressed, regardless of how many of those are there. So foot is a combination of one stressed and a number of unstressed syllables. Sometimes it happens that the foot is incomplete, and we will see the examples when and how. That kind of foot is called catalectic, so that the combination of the syllables is missing one, so that there is like an omission. Nešto nam nedostaje, fali. So that would be the catalectic foot. Meter, so that would be foot. Foot is the combination of syllables with respect to stress. Meter is the number of repetitions of those combinations. So that would be the number of accents or the number of stresses, because as I said before, foot can only have one stressed syllable. So we use Greek numerals to describe the meter. Pentameter and tetrameter would be the most common ones, but there will be a hexameter as well in English. Maximization principle is the rule that tells us when we do try to determine the foot and meter of a verse, we need to follow the principle where the deviations from the regularity is minimal. So that foot would be dominant. That requires for us to deviate from the scheme the least, so least exceptions. Also make note that one line or one poem or one stanza usually uses the same dominant foot. You can't have a combination of 2 feet in the same line or in the same stanza. How do we determine it? To determine the pattern, we look at the line, we have to count the syllables, and then we look for polysyllabic words. That are those which combine 2 or 3 syllables. And we figure out from that polysyllabic word how the stress is positioned, and then we try to work it through the line, through the entire line, reading it out loud and following this maximization principle. Okay, to try out how to do that, usually we would use these lines. And if you find it not clear enough, there is a video in your playlist, how to do scansion. And it's done by a school teacher, American school teacher. So it's really slow and detailed. So I recommend it if you find it difficult to follow here. And she uses the same examples as well. So Robert Frost sopping by woods on a lonely evening. The first line goes, whose woods these are, I think I know. If we count the syllables, whose woods these are, I think I know. We have 8 syllables or 8 monosyllabic words. So each of these is monosyllabic. To determine stress or the position of the stress, we need to read it out loud in a normal way and try to read it in a way that is not, well, that you would not normally read it. So it could be whose words these are, I think I know. So I think would be stressed, I know. And that gives us already a combination of I think, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. If we try to read it in an uncommon way, whose woods, so whose would be stressed, whose woods these are, I think, I know, we recognize that it is not the pattern that would be the rhythm of speech under normal circumstances. So here we decide that the combination is unstressed, stressed, which is I am, and the marking is optional as long as you know which is which. So the cross here is for unstressed. And the repetition happens 4 times, which tells us that it's 4 feet or a tetrameter. So iambic tetrameter. That would be the most common, probably, meter in English poetry. Tetrameter, that is. To illustrate how our catalectic foot functions in the first place and how trochee functions in English, we have a line or 2 lines from William Blake's Tiger. So tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. We notice that there are 7 lines, but we also know 7 syllables in each line, but we also know that tiger is an example for trochee, and it repeats itself, tiger, tiger, burning, so 3 times, and right remains as stress with a missing counterpart, and that would be our catalectic foot. So we determine that it's a trochaic tetrameter with a catalectic foot, which is marked here with a dash, so missing part. The Destruction of Sennacherib by Byron offers us a longer line, and the sheen of the spears was like stars on the sea. If we count it, we can say that we have 12 syllables and all monosyllabic words. We determine that it is not a pattern of 2 because and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea. It doesn't actually create the natural pattern of speaking. That's one reason, or the pleasing rhythm. The other reason is that we have alliteration, sheen, spears, stars, sea. So we've got repetition of sound groups in the words or in the syllables that are supposed to be stressed. And it goes as, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, which brings us to an anapastic tetrameter with alliteration signaling the stress. Again, it's 4 repetitions. Finally, Alfred Lord Tennyson and the Charge of the Light Brigade offers us an illustration of dactylic foot. The Charge of the Light Brigade is a dedication to a cavalry unit that was destroyed in the Crimean War. And cavalry is the key here. So half a league, half a league, half a league onward. We have 11 syllables. Onward is a polysyllabic word with the stress on the first part, so onward. And it's a pattern of 3 with a missing part. If we look at it, half a league, half a league, half a league onward is a dactylic tetrameter. It also is important because it sort of emulates horses' hoofs. So half a league, half a league, half a league, like horses are marching into the battle. If you wish to look at the full text, it's linked underneath. Also, we can have odd examples which would break this regular rhythm. I sing a song of my sea adventure. I sing a song of sorrow unceasing. And as you can see here we have a iambic rhythm, but it sort of breaks into a pyrrhic and then continues with the change. It becomes different. And again, this change here is moved or sort of pushed to the right in order to avoid monotony of repetition. So it could deviate from the standard scheme. You will not get that in your midterm. You will just be asked to recognize one single line that would be relatively regular. Okay, so I think that would be all for today. I think, yes, here is an example or the video explaining you the red wheelbarrow if that we didn't check yet. Do you have any questions? Do you have any, well, any problems so far? Okay, tomorrow we'll continue talking about poetry, or we'll give it a broader context, and we will continue talking about poetry or structuring of poetry in terms of full structures or macro levels. And I will see you tomorrow at 10:30. If you do figure out any questions, please let me know about the quiz or the midterm. Okay, bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.